My daughter called me on a Tuesday morning and said, "Mom, you do not need to come up this summer because Greg thinks it is better if we just keep the lake house for our nuclear family." I built that house with my late husband, using my own hard-earned money. So I did what any sensible woman would do. I sold it out from under them before the 24th of June. I was standing in my laundry room, folding the heavy blue and white striped beach towels I kept specifically for the Lake Geneva house. I had packed for this trip the exact same way for over 20 years. June was always our month. My late husband David and I had spent 2 years designing every inch of that property. We chose the custom cedar siding, the wide wraparound deck, and the exact placement of the guest house so it would catch the morning sun. After David passed away, that house became my sanctuary. At 68 years old, my life had settled into a quiet, predictable rhythm. I had spent 4 decades working as a senior corporate auditor. I made my living finding the hidden numbers, exposing corporate lies, and bringing order to financial chaos. When I retired, I traded spreadsheets for gardening, reading, and those peaceful summer weeks by the water with my daughter Sarah and my grandchildren. My phone began to ring on the kitchen counter. I set down the stack of folded towels and walked over to answer it. The caller identification showed Sarah. I smiled, thinking she was calling to coordinate our grocery list for the weekend. We always planned our meals together before I drove up. I answered the phone with a warm greeting, asking her if we needed to buy extra charcoal for the grill this year. Sarah did not answer my question. Her voice sounded thin and strained. She stumbled over her words, clearing her throat twice in the span of 10 seconds. She said my name instead of calling me Mom, which was my first warning sign. Then she delivered the blow. She told me I did not need to come to the lake this summer. She rushed through the sentence as if she were reading a script someone else had written for her. She said Greg felt it was better if they kept the property just for their nuclear family this year. The silence in my kitchen was absolute. The words hung in the air, foreign and cruel. I had paid for her entire college education, funded her wedding, and given her full access to the single most valuable asset I owned. I opened my mouth to ask her what she meant, to ask why I was suddenly being excluded from the home I built. Before I could form the words, I heard a rustling sound on the line. The phone changed hands. Greg came on the speaker. Greg is a mid-level commercial real estate broker. He has always worn suits that are slightly too expensive for his income bracket and smiled with his teeth, but never his eyes. He did not greet me. He immediately adopted a low, patronizing tone. It was the exact voice people use when speaking to a child or a patient with dementia. He said they had been talking about my health. He brought up the very slight limp I had developed after a minor hip issue last winter. He called the beautiful wooden stairs leading down to the private dock a serious liability for a woman of my advanced age. He said he simply could not relax and enjoy his weekend knowing I might take a spill and break a hip on his watch. He finished his rehearsed speech by stating that he and Sarah desperately needed the space for crucial nuclear family bonding, away from outside distractions. I was an outside distraction. In the home I owned, paid taxes on, and maintained. I did not cry. I did not raise my voice or demand an explanation. I did not ask to speak to my daughter again. I simply pulled the phone away from my ear and pressed the end call button. I placed the phone gently on the granite countertop. For perhaps 2 minutes, I stood perfectly still. The grief of being rejected by my own daughter washed over me, a sharp and sudden pain in my chest. But grief is an emotion, and 40 years of auditing had trained my brain to compartmentalize emotion the moment things stopped making logical sense. My tears dried before they could even form. The grief instantly morphed into a cold, hard suspicion. Greg had never cared about my mobility. Just last Thanksgiving, he had watched me carry a 20-pound turkey out of the oven without offering a single word of concern or a helping hand. He had never worried about the stairs at the lake house before. He had never cared about safety liabilities. Greg only cared about two things in this world: status and money. If a man who only cares about money suddenly bans you from a multi-million-dollar property you own, he is not worried about your hip. He is running a play. I left the folded beach towels on the laundry room counter. I walked directly into my home office and sat down at my desk. I opened my laptop and woke up the screen. I opened my web browser and navigated straight to the county property tax portal for the Lake Geneva district. The property was fully paid off. I held the deed free and clear. I paid the property taxes every January and July. But as an auditor, I knew that the first step in any real estate fraud often begins with intercepting official communications. I typed in my parcel identification number. The screen loaded my property details. The owner name still correctly listed Clara and David Estate Trust. But when my eyes scanned down to the mailing address for the tax assessments, my blood ran cold. The address had been altered. It no longer listed my primary suburban home. The official county mailing address for all tax documents, legal notices, and property assessments had been changed to a commercial post office box in downtown Chicago. I recognized that zip code immediately. It was the exact same zip code where Greg leased his commercial real estate office. My son-in-law had deliberately diverted all legal correspondence regarding my lake house to himself. He had effectively blinded me to any official action being taken on my property. You do not change a tax mailing address to facilitate nuclear family bonding. You change it when you are hiding something massive. I closed the laptop. I did not call my lawyer yet. I needed eyes on the ground. I needed to see exactly what Greg was using my property for. I walked to the hallway closet, grabbed my keys, and walked out the front door. The drive to Lake Geneva takes exactly 2 hours and 15 minutes from my driveway. I drove in complete silence. I did not turn on the radio. I kept both hands on the steering wheel, staying perfectly at the speed limit. The highway melted away as my mind processed the variables. Greg was a broker. He dealt in commercial spaces, liquidations, and private equity. He lived above his means. Sarah was always anxious about their credit card bills. Now he had isolated a high-value asset and locked the legal owner out. I took the familiar exit off the interstate and navigated the winding, tree-lined roads that led toward the water. The summer air was warm, and the lake sparkled through the gaps in the expensive lakefront homes. I did not drive directly to my property. I knew Greg would recognize my car. Instead, I turned down a public access road about 1/4 mile past my property line. I parked my sedan behind a thick row of mature pine trees, completely out of sight from the main road. I got out of the car. I walked carefully through the wooded path that connected the public access area to the neighboring property lines. My slight limp did not slow me down. I navigated the familiar terrain until I reached the dense cluster of oak trees that bordered the western edge of my lot. I stopped behind a large oak tree and looked at the house I had built. It was not a quiet family weekend. There was no nuclear family bonding taking place. The driveway was packed with luxury vehicles. I counted 4 black Mercedes sedans, 2 Range Rovers, and a Porsche. A large, unmarked white catering van was parked near the side entrance, its back doors wide open as staff in crisp white shirts carried silver trays of food into my kitchen. I moved slightly closer, remaining completely hidden within the tree line. The expansive wooden deck overlooking the water was crowded with people. There were no children running around. There were no families in bathing suits. There were roughly 20 men and a few women, all dressed in high-end business casual attire, linen blazers, expensive slacks, designer sunglasses. They stood in small clusters, holding champagne glasses and premium cocktails. And then I saw Greg. He was standing near the edge of the deck, holding a drink, holding court. He looked entirely in his element. He was speaking to 3 older men who carried the distinct posture of extreme wealth. I stood perfectly still and watched my son-in-law perform. He was not acting like a host throwing a summer party for his friends. He was using a specific set of physical gestures I recognized from my decades in the corporate world. He pointed out toward the private dock, sweeping his arm to indicate the depth of the water frontage. He turned and pointed toward the recently renovated guest house, nodding emphatically as one of the older men asked him a question. He stomped his expensive leather shoe against the cedar deck, demonstrating the structural integrity. Greg was not entertaining guests. He was pitching an asset. He was giving a guided tour of a commercial opportunity. The men he was talking to were not his friends. They were looking at the roof lines, inspecting the retaining walls, and calculating the square footage. They were investors. I watched as Sarah came out onto the deck. She looked nervous, wearing a tailored dress that looked brand new. She smiled tightly, handing a fresh drink to one of the investors. She looked terrified, playing the part of the dutiful wife, supporting her successful husband. She was actively participating in whatever scheme Greg was running. The chain of conflict linked together in my mind with absolute clarity. The altered tax documents, the sudden concern for my mobility, the banishment from my own property, the corporate catering, the wealthy men inspecting my retaining walls. This was a financial play. Greg was heavily underwater in his own life, and he was using my $2.8 million property to save himself. He needed me far away from this house because he was presenting it to these men as his own asset. He was leveraging my life's work to secure his own future. I did not confront him. I did not storm onto the deck and embarrass my daughter in front of those men. An amateur makes a scene. An auditor gathers evidence and prepares for total financial annihilation. I turned my back on the house. I walked quietly through the woods, back to the public access road, and returned to my car. I got behind the wheel and started the engine. Greg thought he had successfully isolated a frail, grieving widow. He had no idea he had just initiated a war with a woman who had spent 40 years dismantling corporate fraud for a living. I put the car in drive and headed back to the city to make my first move. I pulled my sedan into my driveway just as the streetlights began to flicker on across the neighborhood. I did not bother opening the trunk to retrieve my packed luggage or the heavy blue and white striped beach towels I had meticulously folded earlier that morning. I left the car locked, walked straight up my concrete front steps, and let myself into the quiet house. I bypassed the living room entirely and headed straight for the kitchen. I needed caffeine, and I needed immediate reinforcements. I picked up my cell phone from the granite counter and dialed a number I had not used since my retirement party 4 years ago. Brenda answered on the third ring. Brenda and I used to share a corner office during my last 10 years at the corporate auditing firm. She was a brilliant forensic accountant who eventually acquired her private investigator license because she found hunting corporate criminals far more satisfying than presenting quarterly tax strategies to board executives. I asked her how quickly she could pack her mobile servers and get to my house. She did not ask me why I was calling so late or what the emergency was. She knew me well enough to hear the absolute seriousness in my voice. She just asked if she needed to bring the heavy decryption drives and the high-speed scanners. I told her to bring absolutely everything she owned, because we were going to war. She arrived at my suburban house exactly 40 minutes after my phone call. She walked through my front door wearing dark jeans and a leather jacket, carrying 2 heavy metal briefcases, a thick stack of manila folders, and a large thermos of her own dark coffee. We did not exchange pleasantries or polite hugs. She took one look at my face, set her heavy equipment on my large mahogany dining table, and asked me who we were investigating today. I walked to the kitchen and poured us both large mugs of black coffee while I explained exactly what I had seen at the lake house earlier that afternoon. I told her about the altered county property tax documents, the unmarked white catering van parked on my grass, and the wealthy men inspecting the retaining walls of my property. I described the specific way Greg was gesturing toward my private wooden dock, pitching the vision of the estate to those men in expensive suits as if he had built it himself. Brenda did not interrupt me. She simply nodded, took a sip from her mug, opened her primary laptop, and began connecting various thick black cables to a secondary portable monitor she pulled from her briefcase. She asked for Greg's full legal name, his exact corporate business address, and his federal tax identification number. I recited his tax identification number completely from memory, having helped my daughter Sarah prepare her joint tax returns for the past 5 years. Brenda typed the numbers into her system. Her fingers moved across her keyboard with the speed and precision of a concert pianist. The dual screens illuminated my dark dining room with glowing lines of data, public records, and restricted financial registries. We sat at that table for 4 solid hours. The only sounds in the house were the steady clicking of her keys, the low hum of the laptop fans, and the occasional rustle of paper as I reviewed the physical documents she told me to print. I watched her cross-reference limited liability companies, track routing numbers across state lines, and dig into the corporate filings of his supposedly successful commercial real estate brokerage firm. She ran background checks on his business partners, his vendors, and his listed corporate assets. At midnight, Brenda pushed her chair back, stretched her arms over her head, and rubbed her eyes. She turned to me and stated plainly that Greg's commercial real estate firm was not just struggling, it was a complete illusion, a house of cards waiting for a single gust of wind. She pulled up a series of banking ledgers on her secondary monitor and pointed to the red figures cascading down the screen. I leaned over her shoulder, putting on my reading glasses to inspect the numbers. Greg was completely bankrupt. He had leased his expensive downtown glass-walled office space on credit. He had leased his luxury vehicles on credit, floating the monthly payments from one credit card to another. He had even financed his tailored suits and expensive watches through high-interest personal loans. But the most alarming discovery was hidden in a secondary holding account registered under a blind shell company in Delaware. Brenda traced the digital breadcrumbs backwards through 3 different banks and found the original source of the capital. Greg was exactly $800,000 in debt. He did not owe this money to a standard bank or a traditional lending institution. He owed it to a syndicate of aggressive private lenders. These were hard money men operating out of Chicago who charged exorbitant interest rates and did not rely on polite collection letters when their monthly payments were missed. They were the kind of men who ruined lives and seized assets by force. I stood up and walked back to the kitchen counter to pour a second round of coffee. My hands were perfectly steady as I held the glass carafe. I walked back to the dining room, set her mug down, and asked Brenda how a man with $800,000 in toxic, dangerous debt was managing to host lavish catered parties with expensive champagne at my lake house. Brenda turned back to her laptop and initiated a deep dive into Greg's recent digital communications. She deployed a tracking software that allowed her to intercept a digital trail of encrypted loan applications. Greg had submitted these massive applications to a large private equity firm. He was attempting to secure a $3 million commercial bridge loan. He claimed on the application that he needed the massive injection of capital to expand his brokerage firm and hire a dozen new commercial agents. Brenda and I both knew he planned to use the cash to pay off his dangerous creditors, cover his massive tracks, and pocket the rest to maintain his wealthy facade. I sat down and stared at the glowing screen, processing the sheer audacity of his request. A commercial bridge loan of that magnitude required massive, untouchable collateral. I asked Brenda what asset Greg had possibly listed on the application to guarantee $3 million in cash. She did not say a word. She simply highlighted a specific line on the digital application form and turned the monitor toward me so I could read it myself. There, listed as his primary leverage, was my beautiful custom-built property in Lake Geneva. He had formally valued my home at $2.8 million and offered it directly to the lenders as his own personal collateral. I picked up the printed loan application and read the fine print twice to make sure my eyes were not deceiving me. How does he plan to secure a massive commercial loan against a property he does not legally own? I asked, placing the paper back on the wooden table. The deed is in my name alone. My estate trust is airtight. He cannot mortgage a house without my physical signature in front of a bank officer." Brenda agreed. She told me that private equity lenders were ruthless, but they were certainly not stupid. They would demand absolute proof of ownership before releasing $3 million into Greg's bank account. They would require a clean title, a clear deed, and a signed transfer of assets. She cracked her knuckles and initiated a targeted scan of Greg's deleted email folders and temporary cloud storage drives. We spent another 2 hours combing through dense digital files, searching for the missing piece of his fraudulent puzzle. The house was completely silent, except for the sound of my grandfather clock ticking in the hallway and the steady rhythm of Brenda typing. At 3 a.m, Brenda finally found the smoking gun. It was a drafted, highly detailed legal document attached to an email sent between Greg and a man named David. Brenda ran a quick background check on David and discovered he was a disgraced former paralegal who now operated as a public notary in a neighboring county, known for ignoring legal protocols for cash. She opened the file attachment and sent it directly to my wireless printer. The machine whirred to life and spit out 3 pages of dense legal text. I picked up the warm pages and read the bold header. It was a fraudulent quitclaim deed. The document falsely stated that I, Clara, was willingly and permanently transferring the total ownership of my Lake Geneva property to my son-in-law, Greg, for the sum of $1. I flipped to the final page. There was a blank line waiting for my signature, right next to the exact spot where David, the corrupt notary, would stamp his official state seal to make the forgery look perfectly legitimate to the private lenders. I traced my index finger over the blank signature line, feeling a deep, cold anger settle permanently in my chest. Brenda brought up the email chain on her primary screen and read the messages aloud. Greg had scheduled the corrupt notary to stamp the forged quitclaim deed on the morning of June 24th. The deadline for the private equity bridge loan was that exact same afternoon. Everything in his desperate life hinged on that specific Friday. If Greg submitted the stamped deed to the lenders on June 24th, they would wire the $3 million to his account by the end of the business day, and I would instantly lose the home I built with my late husband. I stood up and paced the length of my dining room, matching my slow steps to the ticking of the clock. The pieces of the conflict locked together in my mind, forming a perfectly clear picture of his deception. I finally understood why I had been abruptly banned from my own lake house under the guise of nuclear family bonding. I understood why he had changed the tax mailing address to his corporate post office box. He was systematically creating a paper trail to show continuous financial responsibility for the property. I walked over to the front window and looked out at the dark street, watching a stray cat dart under a parked car. Greg needed physical possession of the property to show his private lenders that he had de facto control of the asset before he filed the forged deed. That was exactly what I had witnessed from the safety of the tree line. The catered party, the expensive suits, the guided tour of my dock and my guest house. He was meticulously staging the property to convince the private equity men that the house was his domain and his asset. He needed me far away in the suburbs, so I would not accidentally walk out onto the wooden deck and ruin his carefully constructed illusion of ownership. The sheer arrogance of his plan was almost impressive. He thought he could seamlessly steal a $2.8 million asset, forge my signature, and save his own skin without me ever noticing until it was too late. He thought I was just an old, tired woman who would sit quietly at home folding beach towels while he stole my entire legacy out from under me. Brenda closed her laptop screen halfway and looked at me across the table. She pointed out that today was June 4th. We both looked at the floral calendar hanging on my kitchen wall. Greg's absolute deadline to secure the bridge loan and file the forged quitclaim deed was June 24th. That gave me exactly 20 days. I had less than 3 weeks to completely dismantle his financial scheme, protect my life savings, and tear his false empire to the ground before he destroyed my family. I did not feel fear. I did not feel panic or the urge to cry. I felt the cold, sharp focus of an auditor who has just found the fatal flaw in a criminal's ledger. I turned away from the window, walked back to the dining table, and sat down across from Brenda. I told her to pack up her equipment and send me the encrypted files. She nodded, pulling the flash drives from her computer and slipping them into her metal briefcase. I thanked her for her incredible work and promised her a very large bonus when this was over. She smiled, told me to give him hell, and walked out my front door into the early morning light. I stayed at the table alone, watching the sunrise. I had a ticking clock, and I needed to call my estate attorney the moment his office opened. The sharp sound of the doorbell interrupted the quiet hum of my refrigerator on a Thursday morning. I wiped my hands on a kitchen towel and walked slowly down the hallway to the front entrance. Looking through the small glass peephole, I saw a man waiting on my porch. He wore a clean blue polo shirt and perfectly pressed khaki trousers. He held a metal clipboard in one hand and a digital laser measuring device in the other. He did not carry a tool bag or wear work boots. I unlocked the heavy deadbolt and pulled the door open. The man offered a bright and rehearsed smile. He introduced himself as a specialized contractor sent directly by my son-in-law Greg and my daughter Sarah. He told me his company had been hired to evaluate my primary residence for critical accessibility improvements. He specifically mentioned installing safety grab rails in the master bathroom and a mechanical chairlift for the main staircase. He said Sarah was incredibly worried about my newly developed limp and wanted to ensure I could navigate my own home safely as my health declined. I looked down at his metal clipboard. The top sheet of paper was a standardized residential property appraisal form. It contained 0 references to medical safety equipment or accessibility modifications. Greg was not satisfied with simply stealing my beautiful lake house. He was actively assessing the total market value of my primary suburban residence. He wanted to know exactly how much equity he could extract from my entire life. He was planning to liquidate every single asset I owned before forcefully moving me into a state-run care facility. I opened the door wider and invited the man inside the foyer. I immediately dropped my shoulders forward and let my hands tremble slightly. I leaned heavily on my right leg, exaggerating the minor hip issue I had experienced last winter. I thanked him for coming and told him in a high, thin voice that my memory was simply not what it used to be. I asked him if today was Wednesday or Thursday. He answered very slowly while his eyes scanned the expensive custom crown molding in my entryway. He said it was Thursday. I nodded slowly and asked if he would like a cup of hot tea before he commenced his work. He tried to politely decline, saying he was running on a very tight schedule. I ignored his refusal and began walking deliberately toward the kitchen, dragging my right shoe across the polished hardwood floor. I knew he would feel obligated to follow me. I put the copper kettle on the stove and turned the burner on high. I spent 5 full minutes retrieving 2 delicate porcelain teacups from the upper cabinet, moving with agonizing slowness. I watched him out of the corner of my eye while the water boiled. He was not examining the bathroom layout down the hall. He was aiming his yellow laser measuring device at the far walls of my kitchen, calculating the total square footage of my open-concept living space. I brought the hot tea to the formal dining table. My hands shook perfectly, causing the hot liquid to rattle loudly against the ceramic saucers. I asked him to sit down with me. He sat on the absolute edge of his chair, looking highly impatient and checking his watch. I asked him about his family and whether he enjoyed building safety rails for a living. I intentionally repeated the exact same question about his children 3 times within a 10-minute span. Each time I asked, he gave me a deeply pitying look and answered slower than the time before. I was delivering exactly what Greg desperately needed him to see: an incompetent, frail old woman who had completely lost her grip on reality. He drank his tea quickly and stood up from the table. He told me he needed to measure the master bathroom upstairs to ensure the safety rails would fit properly. I told him to take his time and that I would remain downstairs because the tall staircase was simply too difficult for my weak legs today. I sat at the dining table and listened to his heavy footsteps moving across the second floor. He walked into the master bedroom. He walked into the 2 guest rooms. He walked into the upstairs home office. He was systematically pacing out the dimensions of every single room to finalize his real estate appraisal report. 20 minutes later, he came back down the wooden stairs. He made a grand show of writing something important on his clipboard. He told me he had gathered all the measurements he needed for the bathroom rails and that his office would contact Greg with the final installation schedule. I walked him to the front door, shuffling my feet the entire way. I thanked him profusely for helping keep me safe in my old age. I told him to tell my wonderful son-in-law thank you for taking such excellent care of his elderly mother. He gave me one last patronizing smile and walked down my driveway to his unmarked sedan. I closed the front door and locked the heavy deadbolt. I stood up perfectly straight. I stopped shaking immediately. I walked back to the kitchen with a steady, even stride and poured the remaining tea directly down the sink drain. Greg had sent a covert appraiser to my house to prepare my primary residence for a silent liquidation sale. He felt absolutely secure in his criminal plan because I had just provided his appraiser with a flawless performance of a deteriorating mind. He thought he held absolute control over my future. It was time to show him what a real silent sale actually looked like. I walked straight to my bedroom closet and changed into a tailored charcoal business suit. I put on my pearls and applied my makeup with sharp, professional precision. I drove my sedan to the downtown financial district and parked in the underground garage of the glass high-rise building where my estate attorney kept his executive offices. Thomas had been managing my legal affairs and my late husband's complex corporate contracts for over 2 decades. He was a brilliant lawyer who specialized in aggressive wealth preservation and bulletproof trusts. I walked into his private corner office and sat down in the leather wingback chair across from his massive mahogany desk. I did not waste valuable time with small talk. I opened my briefcase and pulled out the encrypted flash drives and printed financial documents Brenda, the forensic accountant, had gathered for me the previous night. I slid the thick stack of papers across the polished wood surface. I pointed specifically to a printed document labeled image_3C412A.jpg, which clearly displayed the digital metadata of the forged signature file. I placed the intercepted digital copy of the forged quitclaim deed squarely on top of the pile. Thomas put on his reading glasses and methodically reviewed the documents. The large office was dead silent as he read through the forensic dossier detailing Greg's massive $800,000 private debt. He read the printed emails coordinating the corrupt notary. He studied the file named image_3C412A.jpg with deep concentration, verifying the dates and timestamps. Then he picked up the forged quitclaim deed. His face turned a deep mottled red. He took off his glasses and dropped them onto the desk blotter. He leaned forward and told me we needed to contact the district attorney's white-collar crime division immediately. He wanted to call the local police precinct and have Greg arrested for attempted real estate fraud and conspiracy to commit elder abuse before the sun went down. He grabbed his desk phone and told me he had a high-ranking contact in the fraud unit who could fast-track the criminal investigation. I reached across the desk and gently pressed my hand down on the telephone receiver, disconnecting the line. I looked Thomas directly in the eyes and told him we were absolutely not calling the police. Thomas argued with me. He said the forged deed was irrefutable criminal evidence. He said Greg was a highly dangerous and desperate man who was actively trying to steal my entire $2.8 million estate. I explained my strategic reasoning with absolute clarity. I told Thomas that white-collar fraud investigations take several years to fully untangle. If we called the police today, Greg would simply hire a smooth criminal defense lawyer and claim the forged deed was a massive misunderstanding. He would claim he was just preparing hypothetical paperwork in case my health failed unexpectedly. My daughter Sarah would absolutely take his side. She would stand in a courtroom and cry for a sympathetic judge, claiming I was a confused elderly woman experiencing a paranoid episode. They would successfully tie my assets up in endless litigation, while Greg quietly filed bankruptcy and slipped away from his aggressive private lenders. I told Thomas I refused to endure a messy public trial that dragged on for 3 excruciating years. I wanted a lethal and immediate financial counterstrike. I wanted Greg to walk blindly and irreversibly into his own criminal trap. I leaned back in the leather chair and gave Thomas my exact legal instructions. I told him we were going to legally and completely silently sell the Lake Geneva property right out from under Greg. Thomas stared at me in profound shock as the sheer brilliance of the defensive plan registered in his mind. I instructed him to immediately contact a specific cash buyer holding company we had done lucrative business with in the past. This particular holding company specialized in purchasing luxury waterfront properties and converting them into exclusive high-end corporate retreats. They were notorious in the industry for closing deals with ruthless speed, using liquid cash, entirely avoiding the lengthy traditional bank mortgage approval process. I told Thomas to offer them the beautiful Lake Geneva property at a slight market discount to guarantee their interest. The only condition for the discounted price was a strict, non-negotiable, accelerated closing date. The holding company had to finalize the purchase transfer, the full $2.8 million into my accounts, and take physical and legal possession of the property exactly on June 20th. Thomas looked down at his leather-bound desk calendar. June 20th was exactly 4 days before Greg's absolute deadline to submit the forged quitclaim deed to his aggressive private lenders. If we closed the sale on the 20th, Greg would be attempting to collateralize a property that legally belonged to a massive corporate entity. He would be committing undeniable, verifiable bank fraud directly against ruthless private equity lenders who would never accept excuses or apologies for being scammed. Thomas smiled, a slow, incredibly sharp smile. He pulled a fresh yellow legal pad from his top drawer and picked up his gold fountain pen. We spent the next 3 hours drafting the accelerated sale agreements and strict non-disclosure contracts. We structured the transaction so that my name and the original estate trust would be completely shielded from public county records until the exact moment the massive cash wire cleared. Greg would have absolutely no way of tracking the impending sale. He had altered my property tax mailing address to blind me, but he had foolishly forgotten that I still held the original master deed, free and clear. Thomas picked up his secure office phone and bypassed his secretary, dialing the holding company acquisitions director directly. I sat in the leather chair and listened as Thomas pitched the pristine $2.8 million lake house at a highly attractive price point. The director on the other end of the line was immediately interested. Luxury corporate retreats in that specific waterfront area were in extremely high demand. Thomas smoothly integrated my single, non-negotiable condition into the financial negotiation. The closing date must be June 20th. The director readily agreed to the aggressive timeline, but he required one standard operating procedure before officially authorizing the multi-million-dollar cash wire. He told Thomas his executive board needed to conduct a final in-person walkthrough of the property to verify the structural integrity and high-end interior finishes. Thomas covered the phone receiver with his hand and looked at me with deep concern. This was the only potential complication. Greg was currently occupying the lake house, staging it as his own domain, and vigorously prepping for his massive pre-closing party with his private lenders. If commercial real estate buyers suddenly showed up to tour the property, Greg would realize his scheme was dead. I nodded calmly to Thomas, indicating I accepted the challenge. I told him to schedule the corporate buyers walkthrough for early next week. I already knew exactly how to get a team of corporate buyers inside that house, right past Greg's arrogant nose, without him ever realizing he was giving a guided tour to the new owners. The financial trap was officially set, and the silent countdown to June 20th had begun. Tuesday afternoon brought a sudden and violent summer rainstorm to the suburbs. I was sitting in my living room reading a novel when a heavy black sport utility vehicle pulled aggressively into my driveway. The tires crushed the wet gravel loudly enough to startle me. I stood up and watched through the front bay window as my daughter Sarah stepped out of the passenger side. She immediately opened a large designer umbrella to shield her fresh blowout from the pouring rain. My son-in-law, Greg, exited the driver's side, moving with a frantic, restless energy. He was followed by a third person I did not recognize. The stranger was a tall man in his early 50s, carrying a sleek leather medical bag and wearing a perfectly tailored silver suit. They did not ring my doorbell. Sarah simply used her spare key to unlock my front door and push her way into my foyer. They stood on my hardwood floor, dripping rainwater onto the polished oak. I did not greet them. I simply closed my book and waited. Sarah adopted a mask of overwhelming theatrical concern. She rushed over to my armchair and knelt beside me, reaching for my hands. She told me they had been incredibly worried about me ever since the contractor visited my house last week. She claimed the man had called Greg personally to report that I was exhibiting severe signs of memory loss and dangerous physical frailty. Greg stepped into the center of the living room and introduced the stranger as Dr. Harrison. Greg explained that Dr. Harrison was an exclusive concierge physician who provided discreet private medical assessments for high net worth families. I knew exactly what this was. Greg was absolutely terrified that I might decide to take a drive up to Lake Geneva and ruin his carefully orchestrated lender walkthroughs. He needed me legally incapacitated and physically confined to my suburban house immediately. I slipped my right hand into the pocket of my knit cardigan. I unlocked my smartphone entirely by touch, relying on muscle memory to open the voice memo application. I pressed the record button and left the phone hidden deep inside my pocket, capturing every single word spoken in that room. Dr. Harrison did not bother building a rapport. He opened his leather bag and pulled out a silver pen and a small notepad. He stood over me and began asking highly patronizing diagnostic questions in a rapid-fire sequence. He asked me to identify the current president of the United States. He asked me to count backward from 100 by sevens. He asked me if I remembered where I was currently sitting. I knew that if I answered his questions with the sharp precision of a corporate auditor, they would simply escalate their tactics and perhaps call an ambulance to force a psychiatric hold. I needed them to believe they were winning. I began to rub my temples with my fingertips. I let my breathing become shallow and uneven. I looked at Dr. Harrison and intentionally slurred my words just a fraction of an inch. I answered his question about the president by naming a man who had left office over a decade ago. I started counting backward from 100, but stopped at 86, claiming my head was pounding too loudly to focus on the numbers. Sarah let out a dramatic sob and buried her face in her hands. Greg seized the opportunity instantly. He pulled a thick manila folder from his jacket and dropped it onto my glass coffee table. He leaned over me, pressing a heavy gold pen directly into my palm. He told me Dr. Harrison was officially diagnosing me with rapid onset dementia. He said, for my own physical safety, I needed to sign a medical power of attorney immediately. He promised that signing the document would allow him and Sarah to manage my health care, coordinate my daily meals, and hire full-time nurses to keep me safe in my own home. I looked down at the documents spread across my coffee table. The bold black letters at the top clearly stated, granting broad legal authority over all medical and residential decisions. If I signed that paper, Greg would have the legal right to lock me inside this house indefinitely. He could forcibly prevent me from traveling anywhere near Lake Geneva while he finalized his fraudulent $3 million loan. I let the gold pen slip from my fingers. It rolled across the glass table and clattered onto the floor. I closed my eyes and let my head loll back against the fabric of the armchair. I whispered that I was simply too exhausted to read the small print. I told Greg my vision was blurring and my chest felt uncomfortably tight. I begged Sarah to let me take a long nap before I looked at any legal paperwork. I promised them both in a weak, trembling voice that I would read everything over the weekend and sign whatever they needed on Monday morning. Greg's face contorted with pure frustration. He stepped forward and tried to place the pen back into my hand, urging me to just sign the bottom line so I could rest. But Sarah intervened. She stood up and pulled her husband back by his shoulder. She whispered urgently that if they forced a signature while I was complaining of chest pains, it could invalidate the document later. She told Greg they had me exactly where they needed me and that Monday morning would be soon enough. Dr. Harrison agreed, stating his preliminary assessment was complete and rushing a confused patient was bad medical practice. They gathered their things and walked back out into the rain. I listened to the heavy door click shut. I waited until I heard the sound of their luxury vehicle reversing out of my driveway. I pulled my smartphone from my pocket and stopped the recording. I saved the audio file to a secure cloud server and forwarded a direct copy to Thomas, my estate attorney. I had successfully navigated their medical ambush and bought myself the exact amount of time I needed. The house felt entirely different the next morning. The rain had cleared, leaving a bright, cruel sunshine washing over my kitchen floor. I was pouring my first cup of black coffee when my house phone rang. I picked up the receiver and heard my daughter's voice on the line. The theatrical concern from yesterday had completely vanished. Her tone was sharp, clipped, and laced with a cold, calculated cruelty I had never heard from her before. Sarah did not ask how I was feeling after my supposed medical episode. She immediately brought up my 2 teenage grandchildren, Madison and Lucas. She told me the children had been crying all night. She claimed they were absolutely terrified of me after hearing about my severe mental decline. She said my confusing behavior was causing the teenagers deep psychological distress and that she could no longer allow them to be exposed to my deteriorating condition. I stood completely still in my kitchen, gripping the edge of the granite counter. Sarah was weaponizing my own grandchildren against me. She was using the children I had rocked to sleep, the children I had taught to read, as leverage in a financial extortion plot. She delivered her ultimatum with chilling precision. She told me that she and Greg had spoken with an accountant that morning. She said my supposed dementia would create a massive tax burden for the family if I had to be moved into a memory care facility. She instructed me to sign the medical power of attorney and simultaneously sign a quitclaim deed transferring the Lake Geneva property into Greg's corporate holding account for tax protection purposes. She stated very clearly that if I refused to sign both documents by Monday, she would permanently restrict me from ever seeing Madison and Lucas again to protect them from my frightening mental state. My heart physically ached. The betrayal from Greg was expected, but the absolute complicity of my own daughter sliced through me like a razor. She was fully aware of the quitclaim deed. She was an active, willing participant in the scheme to steal my life savings to cover her husband's debts. I kept my voice perfectly steady. I demanded to speak to my grandchildren right that very second. I told Sarah if she wanted my signature on anything, she would put the children on the phone immediately. I heard her sigh heavily before the line clicked and switched to speakerphone. I heard the hesitant voices of Madison and Lucas echoing through the receiver. They sounded confused and heavily coached. Madison asked me if my brain was sick. Lucas asked if I was going to have to go live in a hospital. The sound of their frightened voices broke my heart, but it also solidified my absolute resolve. I needed to protect these children from the financial toxicity of their own parents. I spoke into the phone with a clear, strong, and incredibly warm voice. I told Madison and Lucas that their grandmother loved them more than anything in this entire world. I told them my brain was perfectly fine, and that adults sometimes have complicated paperwork to figure out. I promised them I would always be there for them, no matter what happened in the future. I made absolutely sure they heard the unwavering clarity and love in my words, so they would carry that memory with them when the truth eventually came out. Sarah snatched the phone back and took it off speaker. She told me the children were too upset to continue the conversation. She reminded me that the paperwork would be waiting for my signature on Monday morning and promptly hung up the phone. I listened to the dial tone humming in the quiet kitchen. I placed the receiver back onto the wall mount. The pain of losing immediate access to my grandchildren was profound, but I refused to let it break me. I took a deep breath and deliberately severed the final emotional cord connecting me to my daughter. Sarah was no longer family. She was a hostile corporate entity attempting a hostile takeover of my assets. I locked away my maternal grief and stepped fully back into my role as the auditor. The emotional manipulation had failed, and now it was time to execute my business plan and burn their false empire to the ground. Wednesday morning brought a phone call from my estate attorney, Thomas. I was sitting at my kitchen island drinking a glass of cold water when his name illuminated my cell phone screen. I answered immediately. Thomas did not bother with pleasantries or asking about my health. He launched straight into the financial logistics of our counterstrike. He told me the luxury holding company was absolutely thrilled with the discounted purchase price of $2,800,000. Their executive board had formally agreed to the accelerated closing date of June 20th. They had liquid capital ready to wire directly into my secure accounts. There was only one complication standing between us and the final signature. Thomas explained that the corporate buyers demanded a final in-person walkthrough of the property before they authorized the massive cash transfer. They needed to visually verify the structural integrity of the roof and inspect the high-end interior finishes to ensure the property met their strict corporate retreat standards. I set my water glass down on the granite counter. This was a massive logistical problem. Greg was currently occupying the lake house. He was treating the property as his personal domain. He was actively staging the house and preparing for a massive pre-closing party to impress his own aggressive private lenders. If a team of commercial real estate executives suddenly arrived at the front door to inspect the property they were buying, Greg would instantly realize his fraudulent scheme had been discovered. He would panic, and he might escalate his tactics before I could legally secure my money. Thomas suggested we delay the walkthrough until the weekend, when Greg might be out to lunch. I refused. I told Thomas we did not have time to wait for a convenient window of opportunity. Greg's absolute deadline for his forged quitclaim deed was approaching fast. We had to get the buyers inside that house today. I paced the length of my kitchen, thinking through the variables. I needed a valid, unassailable reason for strangers to inspect every inch of the property. I needed an excuse that would force Greg to open the front doors and welcome them inside without a shred of suspicion. After 3 minutes of silent pacing, the perfect solution materialized in my mind. I instructed Thomas to contact the holding company acquisitions director. I wanted him to propose a very specific undercover operation. The cash buyers were going to pose as commercial insurance inspectors. I told Thomas to explain to the buyers that my homeowner policy mandated a comprehensive structural audit due to the age of the property and its immediate proximity to the water line. The buyers would arrive wearing standard polo shirts, carrying metal clipboards and digital measuring devices. They would play the role of bored municipal workers conducting a routine insurance check. Thomas laughed out loud over the phone line. He loved the absolute audacity of the strategy. He immediately conferenced in the lead acquisitions director for the holding company. I spoke directly to the director, a man named Marcus. I laid out the exact parameters of the ruse. Marcus agreed without hesitation. In the competitive world of high-stakes commercial real estate, corporate buyers were incredibly accustomed to conducting discrete property evaluations. Marcus promised me his team would arrive at Lake Geneva by 2 o'clock that afternoon, dressed exactly like regional insurance adjusters. With the buyers prepared, I had to execute the most delicate part of the trap. I had to call my son-in-law and force him to let them inside. I cleared my throat and practiced softening my voice. I dialed Greg's cell phone. He answered on the fourth ring, sounding incredibly annoyed and short of breath. He demanded to know why I was calling him during his busy workday. I ignored his hostile tone and adopted the persona of a confused, anxious, elderly woman. I told him my insurance company had sent me a very threatening letter in the mail. I claimed the insurance provider was demanding an immediate structural inspection of the lake house roof and foundation. I let my voice tremble perfectly. I told Greg that if the inspectors did not gain access to the property today, the insurance company was going to permanently cancel my coverage. Greg cursed loudly into the phone. I heard the sound of heavy boxes being moved in the background. He complained bitterly about the terrible timing. He said he was incredibly busy managing catering deliveries and setting up formal dining tables for a crucial business meeting he was hosting at the house. I simply apologized and repeated that the insurance cancellation would be a financial disaster. The trap worked exactly as I anticipated. Greg needed the lake house to appear perfectly insured and completely unencumbered for his own private equity lenders. An active insurance cancellation would raise massive red flags during his fraudulent loan approval process. He let out a dramatic sigh of supreme irritation. He told me he would allow the inspectors inside, but he promised to rush them through the house as fast as humanly possible. I thanked him profusely, playing the grateful, subservient mother-in-law. I hung up the phone and smiled. The front door was officially unlocked. I did not stay in the suburbs to wait for the results. I needed to oversee the operation personally. I drove my sedan out to Lake Geneva, arriving just before 2 o'clock. I parked my car in the exact same hidden public access spot I had used during my previous reconnaissance mission. I rolled down my windows to let the warm summer breeze into the car. I had coordinated a specific audio arrangement with Marcus, the lead buyer. Before he stepped onto my property, he dialed my cell phone and slipped his device into the front breast pocket of his polo shirt. The phone line remained completely open. I sat in the driver's seat of my sedan, staring at the dense tree line, listening to a crystal-clear live audio feed of the entire interaction taking place inside my house. I heard the heavy crunch of gravel as Marcus and his partner walked up the long driveway. I heard the solid thud of my brass door knocker striking the front door. 10 seconds later, I heard the heavy wooden door swing open. Greg greeted them with supreme arrogance. He did not introduce himself politely. He immediately demanded that they wipe their boots on the exterior mat before stepping onto the hardwood floors. He spoke to Marcus and his partner as if they were uneducated laborers beneath his social class. He loudly warned them not to touch the expensive floral arrangements or disturb the catering staff who were actively setting up a massive bar on the back deck. I sat in my car and listened to Marcus play his part flawlessly. Marcus adopted a flat, bored tone, asking standard questions about the roof age and the foundation stability. He asked Greg for permission to inspect the structural supports in the basement and the retaining walls near the water. Greg was completely oblivious to the dangers standing in his foyer. He confidently led the undercover buyers through the main living space. As they walked, Greg's monumental ego took total control of the conversation. He simply could not resist the urge to brag to these hired workers about the sheer luxury of his domain. I listened through the phone speaker as Greg gave a guided tour to the very people buying the property out from under him. He pointed out the imported Italian tile in the renovated kitchen. He boasted about the total square footage. When they walked out onto the back deck to inspect the exterior siding, Greg proudly gestured toward the private wooden dock. He loudly claimed that he had personally overseen the installation of the reinforced steel pilings. Marcus asked a brilliant question, disguised as a simple insurance query. He asked Greg if the guest house had any recent plumbing issues that might pose a flooding liability. Greg laughed a harsh, dismissive sound. He told Marcus the guest house possessed entirely brand new copper piping. Greg proceeded to walk the buyers directly into the guest house, detailing the expensive fixtures and the custom glass shower enclosures. He was literally selling the property, doing all the heavy lifting for my real estate transaction while treating the buyers like insignificant peasants. The walkthrough lasted exactly 45 minutes. I listened as Marcus thanked Greg for his time. Greg responded by telling them to make sure they locked the front gate on their way out because he had highly important private investors arriving shortly. I heard the front door slam shut. I heard Marcus and his partner walking back down the gravel driveway. 5 minutes later, Marcus pulled his car out onto the main road. I started my engine and followed him from a safe distance. We drove 3 miles down the highway and pulled into the parking lot of a quiet local diner. I walked inside and found Marcus sitting in a back corner booth. He had already opened his thick leather briefcase and spread the final purchase agreements across the laminate table. Marcus was absolutely thrilled. He told me the property was in pristine condition and the location was perfect for their luxury corporate retreat portfolio. He laughed as he described Greg's absurd, arrogant behavior. Marcus noted that Greg had actually provided a better and more comprehensive tour of the assets than most professional real estate agents ever managed to deliver. I sat down in the booth across from him. I pulled my reading glasses from my purse and methodically reviewed every single page of the commercial purchase agreement. The numbers were exact: $2,800,000. The closing date was locked in permanently for June 20th. I picked up a black pen and signed my name on the bottom line of every required document, transferring total legal ownership of my lake house to the holding company. Marcus countersigned the documents and carefully placed the heavy stack of papers back into his briefcase. He stood up and shook my hand firmly, promising that the cash wire would be initiated immediately on the morning of the 20th. I watched him walk out of the diner and drive away. I ordered a cup of hot tea and sat alone in the booth, looking out the window at the passing cars. Greg was currently standing in my lake house, feeling like a king, preparing to serve expensive champagne to his dangerous private lenders. He believed he held absolute control over my life and my legacy. He had no idea that the ground beneath his feet no longer belonged to him. The paperwork was signed and finalized. The financial trap was officially set, and the countdown to his absolute public destruction was firmly in motion. The morning of June 20th broke with a heavy summer humidity that clung to the windows of my suburban home. I did not bother making breakfast. I drank a single glass of cold water and drove straight to the financial district. I arrived at my estate attorney's office a full 40 minutes before the building officially opened. Thomas was already waiting for me in the lobby, holding 2 cups of black coffee. We rode the private elevator up to his executive suite in complete silence. I sat across from Thomas at his massive mahogany conference table. A secure company laptop rested between us, displaying my primary banking dashboard. The digital clock in the corner of the screen read 8:45. The federal wire transfer system opened at 9. We had exactly 15 minutes to wait. Thomas pulled a thick stack of pristine legal documents from his leather briefcase and aligned them perfectly with the edge of the desk. He looked at me with a profound sense of professional respect. He told me the cash buyer holding company had completely finalized their internal paperwork late last night. Their acquisitions director had personally guaranteed the funds were queued for release. Now we simply had to watch the screen and wait for the digital deposit to clear the Federal Reserve routing protocols. The silence in the room was absolute. I kept my eyes locked on the glowing monitor. I thought about Greg sitting in his leased glass office across town, completely unaware that his stolen leverage was evaporating into thin air. Greg had 4 days left to finalize his fraudulent bridge loan. His absolute deadline was June 24th. He needed my property to save himself from the aggressive private lenders who held his massive $800,000 debt. The digital clock rolled over to 9 o'clock. The banking dashboard automatically refreshed. The loading icon spun for 3 agonizing seconds. Then the account balance updated. $2,800,000 had officially hit my ledger. The funds were completely liquid, verified, and permanently secured. The sale of the Lake Geneva house was final. Thomas let out a sharp breath of relief. He reached across the table and shook my hand firmly. I did not celebrate. I did not smile or lean back in my chair. I picked up the gold fountain pen resting next to the laptop and told Thomas we needed to move to the second phase immediately. The cash sitting in my personal account was still technically vulnerable if Greg somehow managed to fast-track his forged quitclaim deed before Friday. I needed to build an impenetrable financial fortress. Thomas slid the thick stack of legal documents across the polished wood surface. He explained the exact mechanics of the irrevocable trust we had spent the last several days designing. He told me that an irrevocable trust was the ultimate armor in wealth preservation. Once the assets were transferred inside the trust structure, they legally ceased to belong to me as an individual. I would become the primary beneficiary, managed by an independent corporate trustee. He looked me directly in the eyes to ensure I fully understood the gravity of the legal maneuver. He stated clearly that once my signature dried on these pages, I would no longer own my own money. It would belong entirely to the trust entity. No creditor, no fraudulent loan officer, and no desperate son-in-law could ever attach a lien or a claim against assets I did not legally possess. I told Thomas that was precisely the point. I picked up the pen and signed my full legal name on the first document, transferring the entirety of the $2.8 million cash deposit into the irrevocable trust. But I was not finished. I told Thomas to bring out the secondary paperwork. Greg had sent a covert real estate appraiser to my suburban home just days earlier. He was actively planning to liquidate my primary residence the moment he secured his bridge loan. I refused to leave a single scrap of equity exposed to his criminal greed. Thomas presented the deed transfer for my current house. I signed it without a fraction of hesitation. I legally transferred the absolute ownership of my primary suburban residence directly into the irrevocable trust. I moved my remaining retirement accounts, my mutual funds, and my personal savings into the same protected structure. We spent 2 hours initialing pages, stamping seals, and witnessing signatures. We brought in 2 senior partners from the law firm to act as independent witnesses, ensuring the trust execution was completely flawless and immune to any future legal challenges. We used a legitimate certified notary who verified my identity and recorded every document in the official state registry. By noon, I set the gold pen down. I rubbed my wrist and looked at the mountain of executed contracts. Legally speaking, Clara was now completely destitute. I owned absolutely nothing. I had 0 assets to my name. If Greg marched into a bank with his forged quitclaim deed and his corrupt notary stamp, he would be attempting to steal from a ghost. He would be offering collateral that had legally vanished from the earth. I stood up from the conference table, buttoned my blazer, and thanked Thomas for his flawless execution. I walked out of the high-rise building and stepped into the warm afternoon sun. I had successfully stripped my son-in-law of his ammunition. Now, I simply had to wait for him to pull the trigger. The morning of June 24th arrived with bright, cloudless skies. It was the exact kind of beautiful summer Friday that brought tourists flocking to the waters of Lake Geneva. For Greg, it was the absolute deadline to secure his massive commercial bridge loan. He needed to hand the forged quitclaim deed to his private equity investors today or face the brutal wrath of his dangerous Chicago creditors. I stood in my master bathroom and looked at my reflection in the wide mirror. For the past 3 weeks, I had deliberately played the role of a frail, confused, elderly woman. I had worn loose-knit cardigans, sensible orthopedics, and an expression of constant, helpless bewilderment. I had allowed my daughter and my son-in-law to treat me like an infant. I had allowed them to insult my intelligence and weaponize my grandchildren against me. I opened my closet doors and pushed the cardigans aside. That performance was officially over. I reached into the back of my wardrobe and pulled out a pristine navy blue tailored business suit. It was the exact suit I had worn during my final days as a senior corporate auditor. The fabric was sharp, the cut was commanding, and it carried the distinct weight of absolute authority. I put on the suit and stepped into a pair of polished leather heels. I ignored the slight ache in my right hip. I stood perfectly straight, rolling my shoulders back and locking my posture into a rigid, unyielding line. I walked to my jewelry box and took out the diamond earrings my late husband David had given me for our 30th wedding anniversary. I fastened them carefully into place. I applied a sharp coat of crimson lipstick and pulled my silver hair back into a severe, flawless twist. I looked at the woman in the mirror. I did not look like a vulnerable victim suffering from rapid onset dementia. I looked like an executioner preparing to deliver a final verdict. I walked to my home office and picked up a single thick manila folder resting on my desk. Inside the folder was the certified deed of sale, proving the holding company now owned the lake house. Also inside was the massive forensic dossier Brenda had compiled, detailing Greg's crippling $800,000 debt and his communications with the corrupt notary. I tucked the folder under my arm, grabbed my car keys, and walked out the front door. The drive to Lake Geneva took exactly 2 hours. I did not park on the hidden public access road this time. I drove my sedan straight down the main highway and turned directly onto the private paved driveway of the property I had built. The scene unfolding on the sweeping green lawn was a masterclass in extreme financial arrogance. Greg had spared absolutely no expense for his crucial deadline day. 2 private valet attendants rushed to meet my car wearing matching black vests. I waved them off aggressively, parked my sedan directly on the grass near the front walkway, and stepped out of the vehicle, holding my manila folder tightly against my side. The property was crawling with people. A smooth jazz quartet played softly on the expansive wooden deck, overlooking the sparkling blue water. Waiters in crisp white shirts circulated through the crowd, carrying silver trays piled high with fresh oysters and expensive imported champagne. The guests were overwhelmingly male, wearing perfectly tailored custom suits and expensive watches that caught the bright summer sunlight. These were the private equity lenders. These were the men holding the keys to the $3 million bridge loan Greg desperately needed to save his life. I walked slowly up the winding stone path toward the main entrance of the massive cedar house. I observed Greg holding court near the massive outdoor stone fireplace. He was holding a crystal tumbler of scotch, laughing loudly at a joke one of the older investors had just made. He looked completely relaxed, radiating the false confidence of a man who believes he has already won the game. He held a sleek black leather portfolio tucked casually under his left arm. I knew exactly what was inside that portfolio. It was the forged quitclaim deed stamped by his corrupt notary, ready to be presented to the lenders as proof of his collateral. Sarah stood a few feet away from him, talking to the wives of the investors. She wore a bright yellow designer sundress and held a glass of white wine. She looked incredibly tense, checking her phone every few minutes and scanning the crowd with anxious, darting eyes. She knew today was the day they were stealing my entire legacy. I reached the base of the wide wooden stairs leading up to the main deck. I did not hesitate. I placed my polished leather heel on the first step and walked directly toward the heart of the corporate party. I kept my spine perfectly straight, my chin raised high, and my eyes locked onto the man who had tried to destroy my family. I carried my manila folder like a loaded weapon, stepping onto the cedar planks of the house that no longer belonged to me, ready to spring the trap. I pushed open the heavy double doors of the lake house and stepped into the cool marble foyer. The air inside smelled of expensive catering and fresh lilies, but beneath that, I could detect the faint scent of the cedar walls David and I had picked out together. I did not pause to admire the entryway. I walked deliberately through the grand living room, letting the sharp click of my polished leather heels ring out against the hardwood floor. I headed straight for the massive sliding glass doors that opened onto the expansive back deck. I stepped outside into the bright afternoon sun. A jazz quartet was playing a lively tune in the far corner of the deck. Waiters weaved through the crowd, holding silver trays of champagne flutes. I stood perfectly still at the threshold, taking in the sheer volume of Greg's arrogance. Sarah saw me first. She was standing near the outdoor kitchen, holding a crystal wine glass and laughing at something a woman next to her had said. Her eyes drifted past her companion and locked onto my face. Her jaw dropped open. The color drained from her cheeks so completely she looked ill. Her fingers went slack. The crystal wine glass slipped from her hand and shattered violently against the wooden deck, sending a spray of white wine and sharp shards across the cedar planks. The sudden crash of breaking glass caused the jazz quartet to falter. The saxophone player missed a sharp note, lowered his instrument, and stopped playing. The sudden absence of music rippled outward like a stone dropped into a quiet pond. Dozens of animated conversations died in a matter of seconds. Heads turned. All eyes shifted away from the beautiful water and locked onto the sliding glass doors where I stood. Greg was standing near the stone fire pit, laughing with a group of older men. When the music stopped, he turned around, frowning at the band. Then he followed the gaze of his guests and saw me. The confident, wealthy host evaporated in an instant. His face morphed from pale shock to a dark, furious red. He thrust his drink into the hands of a nearby waiter without looking and marched directly toward me. His strides were fast, aggressive, and heavy. He did not greet me. He closed the distance between us using his large frame to block me from the view of his most important guests. He reached out and clamped his large hand around my upper arm. His grip was entirely too tight. His fingers dug painfully through the fabric of my tailored navy suit, bruising my skin. He leaned down, pulling me slightly off balance so his face was mere inches from my ear. His breath carried the sharp scent of expensive scotch mixed with raw, unadulterated panic. "What are you doing here?" he hissed, his voice a venomous whisper meant only for me. "You need to turn around and walk back to your car right now. You are going to ruin everything. If you do not leave this deck this absolute instant, I am calling the police. I will tell them you are a trespassing, confused old woman who wandered away from home. I will have you forcibly removed in handcuffs and locked in a psychiatric ward before the sun goes down. Do not test me, Clara. Get out of my house." I did not flinch. I did not shrink back from his imposing height or cower at his cruel threats. I looked down at his large hand gripping my arm. I tightened my own muscles, shifted my weight to my good hip, and violently yanked my arm downward and away. I broke his physical hold with a sharp, deliberate snap that forced him to stumble slightly forward. I took one solid step toward him, forcing him to step backward or lose his balance entirely. I squared my shoulders, lifted my chin, and took a deep breath of the fresh lake air. I looked past Greg, completely ignoring his physical presence. I scanned the crowd of frozen party guests. My eyes bypassed the wives in their expensive sundresses and the junior brokers holding their drinks. I locked my vision onto the small group of older men standing near the stone fire pit. They wore severe suits, entirely inappropriate for a summer lake party. They held thick leather portfolios and heavy metal clipboards. They were the private equity lenders. They were the ruthless men Greg was actively trying to defraud. I projected my voice across the silent wooden deck. I did not yell. I did not scream hysterically. I spoke with the absolute ringing authority of a senior corporate auditor commanding a hostile boardroom. Greg panicked instantly. He threw both of his hands up in the air and plastered a desperate, sweating smile across his face. He turned his back to me and faced his investors, stepping sideways to physically block their view of my navy suit. He spoke in a loud, falsely soothing voice that echoed awkwardly in the quiet air. "Gentlemen, please forgive this terrible disruption," Greg announced, his voice cracking slightly on the final syllable. "This is my mother-in-law, Clara. I am so deeply sorry you all have to witness this highly personal matter today. She has been suffering from rapid onset dementia for several months now. Her mind is completely gone. She wanders out of her house and gets terribly confused about where she is and who owns what property. It is a tragic family burden. Please, just give me one moment to have my security team gently escort her back to her care facility so we can continue our business." He turned back toward me, reaching out both of his hands as if to corral a stray, frightened animal. He whispered for Sarah to come help him drag me inside. I sidestepped his grasping hands with practiced ease. I walked directly past him, moving straight toward the group of men by the fire pit. Greg scrambled behind me, matching my pace, pleading loudly with the men to ignore my nonsensical ramblings. He promised them we would sign their vital loan documents in his private office, away from this unfortunate family tragedy. He begged them to look away. I stopped exactly 3 feet away from the lead investor. He was a tall man with silver hair, holding the thickest metal clipboard in the group. I looked him dead in the eyes. I held my single manila folder tightly against my side. The investor did not look at Greg. He looked entirely at me, waiting for what I was about to say. "Gentlemen," I said, my voice cutting through the humid summer air with icy precision, "I apologize for the interruption, but I must ask why my son-in-law is attempting to collateralize a property that was sold to a corporate holding company 4 days ago." The silver-haired investor stopped completely still. The heavy metal clipboard in his hand lowered slowly to his side. Around us, the summer breeze off Lake Geneva rustled the leaves of the mature oak trees, but the group of powerful men by the stone fire pit had turned entirely to stone. The cheerful clinking of expensive champagne glasses and the low, confident hum of corporate networking evaporated into a thick, suffocating silence. Greg stood frozen for a fraction of a second before his primal survival instincts kicked into high gear. The blood rushed entirely out of his face, leaving his skin looking like a sheet of damp white paper. He pointed a shaking, sweating finger directly at my face and shouted that I was a complete liar. He raised his voice to a booming, theatrical volume, ensuring the entire deck could hear him. He loudly proclaimed that my debilitating brain disease had made me highly delusional and incredibly vindictive. He took a fast, aggressive step toward me, reaching out his large hands to physically snatch the manila folder from my grasp. He wildly ordered the nearby catering waiters to call for private security to remove a deranged trespasser from his property. He begged the investors not to listen to a single word of my psychotic rambling. I did not back away. I planted my feet firmly on the cedar deck and leveled a cold, unyielding stare directly at my son-in-law. I pulled the folder tight against my chest, keeping it safely out of his reach. The silver-haired lead investor stepped forward and held up his right hand. The simple, quiet motion carried an immense weight of absolute financial authority that stopped Greg dead in his tracks. The investor looked at Greg with sharp, calculating eyes and then looked directly at me. He stated in a deep, gravelly voice that in his particular line of work, he vastly preferred looking at hard paper rather than listening to desperate shouting. He asked me to show him exactly what I had brought in the folder. I unclasped the metal fastener of the manila envelope. I pulled out the top stack of documents and handed them directly to the lead investor. I spoke clearly and professionally, detailing exactly what he was currently holding in his hands. I told him the first document was the official state-certified deed of sale. It clearly demonstrated that a massive corporate holding company had taken absolute legal ownership of the property he was currently standing on. I pointed my index finger to the glowing red seal from the county clerk's office, dated exactly 4 days ago. I watched his eyes rapidly scan the legal description of the parcel, confirming it matched the exact geographical address of the lake house. Greg began to sweat profusely. Large visible drops gathered on his forehead and rolled rapidly down his temples, staining the collar of his expensive linen shirt. He stammered out a frantic, breathless excuse, claiming the paperwork was a sophisticated fake document I had printed off the internet to ruin his party. He vehemently insisted he held the true legal quitclaim deed safely tucked away in his own black leather portfolio. I entirely ignored his panicked babbling. I reached into the folder and handed the investor the second sheet of heavy paper. I announced to the group that it was the federal wire transfer confirmation, showing exactly $2,800,000 moving from the corporate holding company directly into my ironclad irrevocable trust. The federal routing numbers and the official bank authorization codes were bold, dark, and completely undeniable. The lead investor handed the first 2 pages to the men standing silently beside him. The other private lenders crowded around, examining the official state stamps and the banking transfer codes. Their facial expressions shifted rapidly, from polite confusion to dark, dangerous professional anger. They were men who dealt in millions of dollars of risk daily, and they recognized legitimate financial documentation the instant they saw it. I then pulled out the thickest portion of my files. I handed over the comprehensive forensic dossier my private investigator Brenda had meticulously compiled. I instructed the furious investors to read the highlighted sections very carefully. I told them my son-in-law was not a highly successful commercial broker looking to expand his thriving firm. I revealed clearly that he was currently drowning in $800,000 of toxic, desperate debt owed to aggressive private lenders operating out of Chicago. I explained that the quitclaim deed he planned to show them today was a complete forgery waiting for a corrupt notary stamp. He fully intended to use their massive $3 million bridge loan to cover his dangerous tracks, hide his insolvency, and steal my entire life savings. The silver-haired man flipped aggressively through the dossier. He read the intercepted digital communications between Greg and the corrupt county notary. He saw the complex banking ledgers highlighting the massive hidden debts and the dangerously leveraged credit lines. The financial evidence was absolute and independently verifiable. The investor closed the heavy folder with a sharp smack and looked directly at Greg. The look of utter revulsion and disgust on his face was absolute. He told Greg in a remarkably quiet and dangerous voice that attempting to secure a massive commercial loan with a forged deed on a property legally sold to a corporate holding company was federal wire fraud. He informed Greg that their business relationship was completely and permanently terminated, effective immediately. He stated that their corporate legal team would be contacting the state authorities before they even reached their vehicles. Greg opened his mouth to formulate another desperate lie, but absolutely no words came out. He simply stood there, suffocating under the crushing weight of his exposed crimes, while his investors turned their backs on him. The sharp, violent sound of high heels hammering against the wooden deck broke the heavy silence. Sarah pushed her way aggressively through the circle of frozen party guests. Her bright yellow designer sundress whipped around her legs as she marched directly toward me. Her face was contorted into a tight, ugly mask of pure, unadulterated rage. She did not look at the angry departing investors or her sweating, terrified husband. She locked her furious eyes entirely on me. She stopped mere inches from my face and began screaming at the absolute top of her lungs. She demanded to know how I could possibly do this to my own flesh and blood. She accused me of being a bitter, vindictive old woman who wanted to destroy her husband's successful career out of pure malice and jealousy. She shouted that Greg had worked tirelessly to build his brokerage firm and that my insane public stunt had just ruined his professional reputation permanently. She waved her arms wildly, telling the remaining investors that they needed to leave my property immediately because I was mentally unstable and maliciously attempting to sabotage her perfect marriage. She yelled that I was a horrible, toxic mother who cared more about a piece of real estate than the happiness and security of my own daughter. I let her scream. I stood perfectly still with my hands at my sides and allowed her to hurl every toxic accusation and hateful insult she could muster. I watched the wealthy guests on the deck, staring in absolute shock at her massive public meltdown. When she finally ran out of breath and stopped shouting, I looked at the daughter I had sacrificed so much to raise. I felt absolutely no pity for her. I reached into the very back of my manila folder. I pulled out the second and final stack of papers. They were heavily stapled together in the top left corner. I held the stack out and pushed it directly against Sarah's chest, forcing her to physically take it from my hands. I told her in a steady, unrelenting voice that she needed to read those pages very carefully before she ever accused me of ruining her precious marriage again. Sarah snatched the papers from my hand. She glared at me with pure, unmasked hatred before looking down at the top page. I watched her eyes move quickly across the black text. The documents were printed email chains between Greg and a prominent downtown divorce attorney. Brenda had uncovered them hidden deep within a secure deleted server. Sarah read the first email. I watched the furious red flush drain completely out of her face, leaving her skin an ashen, sickly gray. Greg had written to the attorney explaining his exact financial exit strategy. I spoke loudly, ensuring the entire crowd could hear the details of his ultimate betrayal. I told Sarah to read the highlighted paragraph on the second page. It detailed exactly how Greg planned to secure the $3 million bridge loan using my lake house, cash out his dangerous personal debts, and immediately file for divorce. Sarah flipped to the second page, her hands trembling so violently the paper rattled. She read Greg's own typed words, stating that he fully intended to leave his wife saddled with the remaining massive corporate debt, while he relocated to a new state with the stolen equity. He explicitly referred to Sarah in the emails as a naive liability who had outlived her usefulness the exact moment she helped him secure my property. Signature. The heavy papers slipped from Sarah's shaking hands and scattered across the cedar deck, blowing slightly in the breeze. She turned her head slowly and looked at her husband. Greg took a massive step backward, holding his hands up defensively in front of his chest. He tried to stammer out a frantic denial, claiming the emails were completely fabricated documents I had maliciously created to tear them apart. He begged Sarah not to listen to me, swearing his absolute eternal devotion to their marriage. Sarah did not scream right away. She walked forward, deliberately closing the physical distance between them. She picked up a half-empty crystal champagne flute from a nearby cocktail table. She looked Greg directly in the eyes and through the glass with blinding, aggressive speed. The heavy crystal smashed violently against his shoulder, soaking his expensive tailored suit in premium alcohol and sending shards of glass bouncing across the deck. Then the screaming began again. Sarah unleashed a torrent of absolute blinding rage that echoed across the entire lakefront property. She shoved Greg hard against the chest, forcing him to stumble backward into the cold stone fire pit. She screamed his own typed words back at his face, asking him loudly how long he had considered her a naive liability. She humiliated him relentlessly in front of his wealthy peers, his remaining business associates, and the silent, staring catering staff. She detailed his pathetic financial failures, his desperate, endless need for social status, and his cowardly attempt to abandon her and their children. Greg raised his arms, trying desperately to shield his face from her physical blows, begging her repeatedly to stop making a scene in front of the lenders. The investors watched the spectacular, violent implosion of his false empire with cold, absolute detachment. The wealthy men began setting their glasses down on the tables, picking up their heavy clipboards, and signaling their private drivers. The lavish, sophisticated party Greg had orchestrated to save his life had transformed perfectly into the exact instrument of his total public destruction. I stood, quietly adjusting the crisp cuffs of my navy suit, and watched the fire burn. The summer wind off the water carried the sharp scent of spilled wine and raw panic. Greg scrambled across the wet cedar planks, his expensive leather shoes slipping on the shattered crystal. He threw himself directly into the path of the departing private equity men. He held his hands up in a desperate, pleading gesture, physically blocking the silver-haired lead investor from reaching the wooden stairs. Greg began to beg with a pathetic, frantic energy that completely erased his carefully cultivated broker persona. He promised the furious men that he could explain everything. He wildly claimed that the documents I had provided were part of a massive, elaborate misunderstanding regarding his corporate tax structures. He shouted that he had millions of dollars currently tied up in secure offshore escrow accounts, ready to clear by Monday morning. He grabbed the sleeve of the lead investor's dark suit, his voice breaking into a high, breathless whine. He begged them for a simple 48-hour extension. He swore on his life that if they just wired a fraction of the bridge loan to his primary business account today, he would personally guarantee a massive return on their investment by the end of the fiscal quarter. The lead investor looked down at Greg's trembling hand clutching his expensive suit jacket. He did not shout or raise his voice. He simply jerked his arm backward with a sharp, violent motion, breaking Greg's physical hold. He told Greg in a remarkably cold and flat tone that beggars and fraudsters do not dictate the terms of commercial lending. He stepped around my son-in-law and signaled for his associates to continue walking toward the driveway. Greg dropped to his knees right there on the wet wooden deck, sobbing openly, pleading with the backs of the departing men to give him one more chance to prove his absolute financial solvency. Before the investors could reach the bottom of the stairs, the deep, heavy crunch of large tires on the gravel driveway commanded the attention of everyone remaining on the property. 3 massive black sport utility vehicles pulled aggressively onto the pristine front lawn in a tight, synchronized formation. The sleek vehicles parked at sharp angles, completely blocking the circular exit route. The heavy, tinted doors of the vehicles swung open in perfect unison. Marcus, the acquisitions director for the corporate holding company, stepped out of the lead vehicle. He was no longer wearing the casual polo shirt of a municipal insurance inspector. He wore a sharp, tailored black suit and carried a thick leather briefcase. He was immediately flanked by 4 imposing men wearing tactical security uniforms. 2 professional property managers stepped out of the secondary vehicles carrying heavy metal lockboxes, large bundles of keys, and thick stacks of official corporate paperwork. The team moved across the lawn with militant precision. They marched up the wooden stairs and stepped onto the expansive deck. The remaining party guests scattered instantly, moving out of the way of the aggressive security personnel. The catering staff abandoned their silver trays and hastily retreated toward the kitchen doors, recognizing a severe legal situation when they saw one. Marcus walked directly to the center of the deck, his security detail fanning out to secure the perimeter of the structure. Greg slowly pushed himself up from his knees, his ruined suit clinging to his sweating body. He stared at Marcus with a blank, uncomprehending expression. He desperately tried to reconstruct his broken broker persona, wiping his wet face with his sleeve and attempting to offer Marcus a strained, trembling smile. Greg assumed Marcus was another high-net-worth individual arriving late to the pitch, perhaps a wealthy secondary contact who had missed the initial disaster. Greg stepped forward and extended his shaking hand, welcoming Marcus to his beautiful lakefront estate. He stammered out a frantic apology for the current mess, claiming a minor family dispute had temporarily disrupted the corporate networking event. Marcus did not shake his hand. He looked at my son-in-law with an expression of profound corporate indifference. He unclasped his leather briefcase, pulled out a thick, legally binding document bearing a massive red state seal, and shoved the heavy paper directly into Greg's chest. Marcus announced in a booming, authoritative voice that carried across the entire waterfront property that his corporate holding company was now the absolute, verified, legal owner of the estate. He pointed a firm finger at the document in Greg's hands and explicitly identified it as an official, court-mandated vacate order. Marcus stated clearly that Greg was currently standing on private commercial property without an active lease, a valid invitation, or any legal right to remain on the premises. Marcus checked his heavy silver wristwatch and delivered the final, crushing blow. He told Greg he had exactly 30 minutes to remove his personal belongings from the corporate asset. If Greg was still standing on the cedar deck when the clock expired, the private security team was strictly authorized to physically drag him to the curb and formally charge him with criminal trespassing. Greg stared at the vacate order, his eyes scanning the bold, legal print and the undeniable corporate signatures. His mouth opened and closed silently, like a fish suffocating on dry land. He looked wildly around the deck, his eyes darting from Marcus to the imposing security guards to Sarah, who was standing completely paralyzed by the outdoor kitchen. He realized, with absolute, crushing certainty, that his entire false empire had just been legally and physically seized by strangers. The private equity lenders had watched the entire exchange from the edge of the stone pathway. The silver-haired lead investor turned back toward the deck, his expression hardening into pure, unadulterated fury. He realized the absolute sheer scale of the financial crime Greg had just attempted to commit. Greg had not simply offered them an overvalued asset or a highly leveraged home. He had actively tried to collateralize a property that belonged to a massive, well-funded corporate entity. The investor realized that if they had wired the $3 million to Greg's account, they would have been locked in a massive, unwinnable legal war with the holding company over a fraudulent deed. Greg had tried to drag their pristine investment fund directly into a massive federal crime. The lead investor did not walk away to his waiting vehicle. He pulled his smartphone from his jacket pocket and loudly directed his personal driver to park his luxury sedan directly behind Greg's vehicle in the driveway. He instructed the other lenders to do the same. Within seconds, a barricade of expensive cars completely trapped Greg's vehicle on the grass. The silver-haired man dialed emergency services. He stood at the bottom of the stairs and spoke into the phone with a sharp, commanding voice. He formally identified himself and his firm, and he reported a major, highly sophisticated financial crime currently in progress. He explicitly stated that a commercial broker had just attempted to defraud a private equity fund of $3 million using verifiably forged real estate collateral. He demanded immediate police intervention, providing the exact address of the lake house and confirming that the suspect was currently trapped on the premises. Greg heard the entire phone call. A profound, animalistic panic completely overtook him. He dropped the vacate order onto the wet wood and bolted toward the side staircase leading down to the lawn. He intended to flee into the dense woods surrounding the property and disappear before the authorities arrived. He did not make it past the first step. Two of the massive tactical security guards employed by the holding company stepped smoothly into his path, crossing their thick arms over their chests and forming an impenetrable human wall. They did not touch him, but their physical presence was an absolute deterrent. Greg spun around and sprinted toward the main glass doors of the house, hoping to escape through the front foyer. Marcus calmly stepped into the doorframe, blocking the exit and staring Greg down with cold, calculating eyes. Greg was completely trapped on the deck, enclosed by angry investors, private corporate security, and his furious wife. He began to pace frantically in tight, jagged circles, pulling at his own hair and muttering breathless, panicked curses. The distant wail of police sirens pierced the warm summer air. The sound started as a faint, high-pitched hum and rapidly grew into a deafening, terrifying roar. 3 local police cruisers and 1 unmarked detective's vehicle tore down the private paved driveway, their red and blue emergency lights slicing brightly across the green lawn and reflecting off the sparkling water of the lake. The cruisers slammed into park, kicking up dust and dirt. 6 uniformed officers and 2 plainclothes detectives stepped out of the vehicles, their hands resting cautiously on their heavy utility belts as they assessed the chaotic scene. I stood near the heavy wooden railing of the deck, perfectly safe from the commotion. I placed my hands lightly on the smooth cedar wood I had chosen with David so many decades ago. I stood tall and proud in my tailored navy suit, watching the absolute destruction of the man who had tried to discard me. I did not smile, and I did not gloat. I watched with the impassive, untouchable calm of a woman who had successfully executed a flawless audit. The detectives marched up the wooden stairs. The silver-haired investor immediately intercepted them, handing over his own legal portfolio and explaining the exact nature of the attempted wire fraud. He pointed directly to the forged quitclaim deed Greg had left sitting on a cocktail table. Marcus stepped forward and presented the official state-certified deed of sale, proving the holding company legally owned the asset Greg had just tried to leverage. The evidence was overwhelming, immediate, and physically present. The lead detective picked up the forged deed, examined the corrupt notary stamp, and looked directly at Greg. 2 uniformed officers flanked my son-in-law. They grabbed his arms and forcefully spun him around. They slammed his chest hard against the exterior cedar wall of the house. Greg let out a loud, pathetic sob, begging the officers to let him call his lawyer, screaming that he was a respectable broker who was being maliciously framed by his deranged mother-in-law. The officers ignored his frantic, weeping cries. They pulled his arms sharply behind his back. The sharp, metallic click of heavy steel handcuffs locking around his wrists echoed loudly across the quiet lakefront. The lead detective stood mere inches from Greg's ear and read him his Miranda rights in a booming, unyielding voice. He formally announced that Greg was being placed under immediate arrest for attempted felony wire fraud, conspiracy to commit elder abuse, and the presentation of forged legal collateral. Sarah stood frozen by the outdoor kitchen, watching the police drag her weeping, ruined husband across the deck. The remaining investors stared at him with total disgust. The corporate property managers began loudly directing the caterers to pack up their equipment and vacate the premises. The officers hauled Greg roughly down the wooden stairs and shoved him forcefully into the back of a waiting police cruiser. The heavy metal door slammed shut, trapping him inside the cage. I stood on the pristine deck I had built, breathing in the fresh, clean air of the lake, and watched the red and blue lights carry the predator away from my family forever. Exactly 14 days after the police cruisers drove my son-in-law away from the lake house, my front doorbell rang. It was a Tuesday afternoon. The summer heat was pressing heavily against the windows of my suburban home. I walked out of my home office and looked through the glass peephole. My daughter Sarah stood on the front porch. She did not look like the wealthy, confident woman who had hosted a catered corporate event 3 weeks ago. She looked entirely broken. Her blonde hair was pulled back into a messy, unwashed knot. She wore a pair of faded gray sweatpants and an oversized college sweatshirt. She was shivering despite the sweltering humidity. I unlocked the deadbolt and pulled the door open. Sarah did not wait for an invitation. She practically fell into my foyer, dropping her large leather purse onto the hardwood floor. She immediately burst into violent shaking sobs. I did not reach out to hold her. I simply closed the heavy front door and waited for her to speak. Sarah leaned against the hallway wall and began to pour out her absolute financial devastation. She told me Greg was currently sitting in the county jail awaiting his federal trial. A judge had officially denied his bail because his massive $800,000 debt to aggressive private lenders made him a severe flight risk. She said his commercial real estate firm had been raided by investigators and completely shuttered. But her desperate tears were not for her husband. They were entirely for herself. She followed me into the living room, her voice rising to a frantic pitch. She told me the private lenders had aggressively frozen all of their joint checking and savings accounts. The banks had officially initiated foreclosure proceedings on her massive primary residence. She said a man from the bank had literally taped a bright pink foreclosure notice to her expensive front door that very morning. She was facing absolute, imminent bankruptcy. She claimed she had exactly $42 left in her wallet and absolutely no way to buy groceries for my grandchildren, Madison and Lucas. I listened to her desperate rambling without changing my facial expression. I turned my back to her and walked directly into the kitchen. I filled my copper kettle with filtered water and placed it on the stove. Sarah followed me into the kitchen, pacing the length of the granite island. She began demanding that I save her. She told me she knew the holding company had wired $2,800,000 into my accounts. She begged me to tap into that massive cash reserve to pay off Greg's toxic debts and save her house from the aggressive bank liquidators. She slapped her hands flat against my granite counter. She pleaded with me, claiming that I owed it to her as her mother. She said I had more than enough liquid cash to completely erase her financial nightmare and still live comfortably for the rest of my life. She begged me to simply write a massive check and make the horrible consequences go away. The copper kettle began to whistle a sharp high note. I turned off the burner. I pulled 2 delicate porcelain teacups from the upper cabinet. I placed an herbal tea bag into each cup and slowly poured the boiling water over them. I set the cups on 2 ceramic saucers. I picked them up and carried them to the formal dining table. I told Sarah to sit down. Sarah pulled out a chair and collapsed into it. She reached for the teacup with trembling hands. She took a fast, desperate sip and continued her frantic begging. She told me I could not possibly let my own daughter become homeless. She swore that if I just gave her the $2 million, she would pay me back every single penny over the next 20 years. I did not touch my tea. I reached into the right pocket of my tailored trousers and pulled out my smartphone. I placed the device flat on the polished wooden dining table exactly between us. I unlocked the screen using my thumbprint. I opened the voice memo application and located the specific audio file I had recorded weeks earlier during their medical ambush. I looked directly into Sarah's red, swollen eyes. I pressed the play button. The crystal-clear audio filled my quiet dining room. Greg's booming voice echoed from the phone speaker, introducing Dr. Harrison. Then, Sarah's own frantic voice played loud and clear. The recording captured the exact moment she stopped Greg from forcing the gold pen into my hand. The audio played her urgent whisper, telling Greg they needed to wait until Monday morning so I would not invalidate the paperwork by complaining of chest pains. It captured her explicitly stating that they had me exactly where they needed me. The recording continued playing. It captured the exact moment Sarah agreed to actively force a fraudulent dementia diagnosis upon her own mother, simply to steal my lake house equity. It proved beyond any shadow of a doubt that she was a willing, calculating participant in the entire criminal scheme. I pressed the stop button. The sudden silence in the dining room was absolute and suffocating. Sarah stared at the black screen of my smartphone. Her mouth hung open in total shock. The teacup rattled violently against her ceramic saucer. She realized in that exact moment that I had known about her betrayal from the very beginning. She realized I had sat in this very house acting like a confused, frail victim while secretly gathering irrefutable digital evidence to ensure her absolute financial destruction. Sarah slammed her teacup down onto the table. Hot liquid sloshed over the rim and pooled on the polished wood. She pushed her chair back and began shaking her head back and forth. She launched instantly into a frantic, desperate defense. She completely abandoned her husband and pointed all the blame squarely at Greg. She claimed Greg had manipulated her for months. She shouted that Greg had completely hidden the massive $800,000 private debt from her until the very last second. She swore she only went along with the fake dementia diagnosis because Greg told her the aggressive Chicago lenders were threatening to physically harm their family if he did not secure the commercial bridge loan. She sobbed violently, claiming she was just a terrified wife trying to keep a roof over her children's heads. She begged me to forgive her temporary lapse in judgment. I pulled a small linen napkin from the center of the table and calmly wiped the spilled tea from the wood surface. I looked at the sobbing woman sitting across from me. I spoke in a clear, calm, and completely unwavering voice. I told Sarah that I forgave her. Sarah gasped and stopped crying for a fraction of a second. A brief flash of genuine hope illuminated her tired face. She leaned forward, reaching her hands across the table to grasp my fingers. I pulled my hands back and folded them neatly in my lap. I told her to listen to my next words very carefully. I explained that I forgave her because harboring bitter resentment was a toxic burden I refused to carry into my retirement. I forgave her to secure my own absolute peace of mind, but I stated explicitly that offering my personal forgiveness did not mean I was going to fund her terrible mistakes. Sarah's face fell. She opened her mouth to argue, but I raised my hand and silenced her instantly. I told her I was establishing an ironclad boundary regarding my finances and her future. I informed her that the $2,800,000 from the lake house sale and the total equity of my suburban home had been completely locked inside an irrevocable trust. I explained the strict legal mechanics of the trust structure. I told her the money was managed by an independent corporate trustee, and I had zero legal authority to simply write her a massive check to save her foreclosed property. Sarah began to panic again. She asked me how she was supposed to feed Madison and Lucas. She asked how she was supposed to keep them enrolled in their expensive private academy when her bank accounts were entirely frozen by federal investigators. I told her my grandchildren would not suffer the consequences of her criminal greed. I explained that yesterday afternoon I had personally contacted the admissions director at Madison and Lucas Private School. I had legally arranged for my irrevocable trust to pay their full academic tuition directly to the academy. I told her the corporate trustee would wire the funds to the school at the beginning of every semester until both children graduated. I also informed her that the trauma of watching their father get arrested and losing their family home required immediate professional intervention. I told Sarah my trust would pay directly for a licensed family therapist to treat both Madison and Lucas twice a week. The clinical bills would be sent directly to my estate attorney for processing. I leaned forward and looked directly into my daughter's panicked eyes. I told her the trust would pay the school, the trust would pay the doctors, but the trust would never pay her. I stated with absolute finality that Sarah would not see a single dime of my money for the rest of her natural life. No cash would ever pass through her hands. She would not receive a monthly allowance. She would not receive a housing stipend to save her foreclosed mansion. Sarah began to weep again, loudly and bitterly. She asked me where she was supposed to live. She asked how she was supposed to survive without her husband's income and without my financial bailout. I stood up from the dining table. I picked up my smartphone and slipped it back into my tailored trousers. I looked down at the woman who had happily plotted to lock me inside a state-run memory care facility. I told her she would have to find a job. I told her she would have to rent a small, modest apartment and learn how to survive on a strict budget, just like millions of other responsible adults do every single day. I walked past her chair and headed directly to the front door. I pulled the heavy oak door open, letting the thick, humid summer air spill into the cool foyer. I stood by the open door and waited. Sarah slowly stood up from the dining table. She grabbed her large leather purse from the floor. She walked down the hallway, moving like a woman walking to her own execution. She did not look at me as she crossed the threshold. She stepped out onto the concrete porch and walked down the driveway toward her vehicle. I did not say goodbye. I pushed the heavy door shut and locked the deadbolt with a solid, satisfying click. The heavy oak door remained firmly shut. The profound silence that followed my daughter's departure settled over the large suburban house like a thick blanket. For the first few days, the emotional vacuum was physically exhausting. I wandered through the empty rooms, tracing my fingers over the antique furniture and looking at framed photographs of a family that no longer existed in reality. I had successfully protected my financial empire, but the cost of that victory was the complete severance of my only child. I did not allow the grief to paralyze me. I understood that remaining in this cavernous property would only anchor me to a painful past. I picked up my phone and called a premium real estate broker. I instructed him to list the suburban house immediately. I did not want to endure a lengthy staging process or host dozens of public open houses. I priced the property competitively to ensure a rapid transaction. The market was incredibly strong, and a young couple signed the purchase agreement just 8 days after the listing went live. I hired a professional moving crew to pack my belongings. I directed them to donate the massive dining table where Sarah had cried her fake tears and the oversized armchairs where Greg had attempted his medical ambush. I kept only my most cherished personal items, my artwork, and my professional wardrobe. I contacted Thomas, my estate attorney, and directed him to coordinate with the corporate trustee. I authorized the trust to purchase a stunning top-floor condominium in a highly exclusive, active senior community on the coast of Florida. I flew down to inspect the property personally before finalizing the transaction. The condominium was an architectural masterpiece. It featured massive floor-to-ceiling windows, a wraparound balcony overlooking the crashing waves of the Atlantic Ocean, and pristine white marble floors. The community itself was vibrant and meticulously maintained, offering private tennis courts, heated swimming pools, and a massive clubhouse. I officially moved in on a bright Tuesday morning, leaving the cold Midwestern memories permanently behind me. I refused to spend my retirement sitting quietly in a rocking chair. I immediately booked a series of extensive international trips. I spent 3 weeks touring the historic vineyards of Tuscany, sampling incredible regional wines, and learning about ancient agricultural techniques. I traveled to Kyoto and walked through the bamboo forests. I joined a luxury river cruise down the Danube River. I threw myself entirely into the experience of living a completely unencumbered life. During these travels and within my new coastal community, I built a brand new circle of friends. These were sharp, accomplished women who had run their own businesses, managed massive corporate departments, and navigated their own complex life challenges. We gathered on my balcony on Friday evenings, drinking craft cocktails and discussing global markets, literature, and politics. They did not look at me with pity or treat me like a frail, confused burden. They respected my sharp mind, my aggressive financial boundaries, and my absolute fierce independence. Despite the wonderful new friendships, I did not abandon my responsibilities to my grandchildren. I established a strict, structured routine for independent visits with Madison and Lucas. I absolutely refused to allow Sarah to use the children as emotional pawns or financial leverage ever again. I coordinated directly with the administration at their private academy to arrange their travel schedules during school holidays. The irrevocable trust paid directly for their first-class commercial flights, ensuring they traveled safely and comfortably from Chicago to my coastal Florida community. When Madison and Lucas arrived for their first extended visit, they looked exhausted and deeply stressed by the chaotic fallout of their parents' criminal actions. I welcomed them into my bright, spacious condominium and immediately set about shielding them from the toxic environment they had left behind. I did not speak a single negative word about their mother or their father. I focused entirely on their immediate happiness and their future goals. We spent long afternoons walking along the pristine white sand beaches, collecting seashells, and watching the pelicans dive into the surf. I took them to high-end seafood restaurants, letting them order whatever they wanted from the menu. We sat on the balcony eating fresh shrimp and talking about their college aspirations. Madison told me she wanted to study international law. Lucas expressed a deep interest in marine biology. I listened to their dreams with absolute, undivided attention. I assured them repeatedly that their academic futures were completely secure and fully funded by the trust. I watched the heavy burden of financial anxiety slowly melt away from their young shoulders. They realized they did not have to worry about losing their home or abandoning their education because their grandmother had built an impenetrable fortress around their inheritance. I sent them back to the Midwest at the end of the summer with deep tans, relaxed smiles, and a profound understanding that they were deeply, unconditionally loved. I had successfully excised the cancer of Greg and Sarah from my daily existence while perfectly preserving the pure, uncorrupted relationship with my grandchildren. 2 years passed in a beautiful, uninterrupted rhythm of ocean tides and spectacular sunsets. The chaos of the forged quit-claim deed, the aggressive private lenders, and the dramatic corporate walkthrough felt like a distant movie I had watched a very long time ago. My life in Florida was a testament to the absolute power of establishing ruthless boundaries. On a remarkably warm Thursday afternoon, I walked down to the polished marble lobby of my condominium building to retrieve my daily mail. The concierge greeted me with a warm smile and handed me a thick stack of catalogs, magazines, and personal correspondence. I thanked him and rode the glass elevator back up to my top-floor sanctuary. I walked into my spacious, pristine kitchen and dropped the stack of mail onto the white quartz island. I began sorting through the envelopes, tossing the junk mail directly into the recycling bin. I stopped abruptly when my fingers brushed against a cheap, thin paper envelope. The stark white paper stood out glaringly against the glossy, colorful magazine covers. I picked up the envelope and examined the front. The postage stamp was a generic bulk rate print. I looked at the return address stamped heavily in dark black ink in the upper left corner. It was an official seal from the State Penitentiary Correctional Facility. I traced my index finger over the handwritten address in the center of the envelope. The handwriting was unmistakably sloppy, rushed, and frantic. It was Greg. He had somehow managed to locate my new Florida address through the prison mail system, or perhaps by begging a sympathetic relative to search public records. I held the thin envelope up to the bright sunlight streaming through my kitchen windows. I could see the dark outlines of several closely written pages folded tightly inside. I did not need to tear the seal to know exactly what those pages contained. I had spent 40 years auditing human behavior, and I knew precisely how a desperate, narcissistic predator operated when completely cornered. The letter would be overflowing with pathetic excuses and cowardly justifications. Greg would undoubtedly blame his aggressive private lenders for forcing him to attempt the real estate fraud. He would blame Sarah for failing to secure my signature during the medical ambush. He would claim he was a victim of terrible circumstances and unfair corporate pressure. The final pages would inevitably pivot from making excuses to begging for salvation. He would plead with me to use my massive financial resources to hire a high-powered appellate attorney to challenge his federal conviction. He would promise to pay me back every single penny if I just helped him overturn his wire fraud sentence. He would try to leverage my love for Madison and Lucas, claiming the children desperately needed their father back at home. I stood in my sunlit kitchen, holding the physical manifestation of his absolute ruin. I did not feel a single ounce of pity, anger, or vindication. I felt absolutely nothing for the man who had tried to lock me in a dementia ward and steal my $2.8 million legacy. I walked smoothly across the hardwood floor and entered my home office. I approached the heavy-duty commercial paper shredder sitting neatly beside my mahogany desk. I reached out and flipped the power switch. The machine hummed to life with a low, powerful vibration. I did not open the envelope. I did not read a single word of his pathetic, desperate pleas. I held the sealed letter directly over the steel feeding slot. I let go. The industrial blades caught the cheap paper instantly. The machine let out a sharp, aggressive grinding noise as it violently pulled the envelope downward. I stood perfectly straight and watched the thick stack of paper disappear into the metal jaws. The machine shredded his excuses, his lies, and his desperate begging into hundreds of tiny, meaningless strips of confetti in less than 4 seconds. The shredder went quiet, returning to a low, steady hum. I reached out and clicked the power button off. I walked back into my kitchen. I opened the door of my stainless steel wine refrigerator. I pulled out a perfectly chilled bottle of crisp, expensive white wine I had purchased during my recent trip to the Amalfi Coast. I used a silver corkscrew to open the bottle, listening to the satisfying pop as the cork released. I retrieved a delicate crystal wine glass from the overhead cabinet and poured myself a generous measure. The pale golden liquid caught the bright sunlight, making the crystal sparkle brilliantly. I picked up the glass by its slender stem. I walked across the spacious living room and approached the massive sliding glass doors. I pushed the heavy glass panel aside and stepped out onto my sprawling private balcony. The late afternoon sun was incredibly warm against my skin. A gentle breeze blew in from the Atlantic Ocean, carrying the sharp, clean scent of salt water and blooming jasmine from the gardens below. I walked to the edge of the glass railing and looked out over the magnificent, endless expanse of blue water. I took a slow, deep breath, filling my lungs with the fresh coastal air. I took a sip of the crisp, chilled wine, letting the complex flavors settle on my tongue. I looked down at the pristine, secure, beautiful life I had built for myself. I thought about the desperate predators who had arrogantly assumed I was just a frail, confused old woman, waiting to be easily discarded and quietly robbed. They had fundamentally misunderstood the basic nature of a woman who had spent 4 decades dismantling fraud and surviving in a ruthless corporate world. They had brought a forged deed to a gunfight. I leaned against the smooth glass railing, listening to the rhythmic crashing of the ocean waves against the white sandy beach. I raised my crystal glass in a silent, solitary toast to the absolute, untouchable peace of total victory. I smiled, letting the warm Florida sun wash over my face, completely free and completely secure.